Perhaps one of the most intriguing questions in all of philosophy is this: are human choices free? This is the question of human freedom and moral responsibility. And really, at first glance, it seems to be almost a self-evident question or a self-evident answer. We get up in the morning and we proceed throughout the day as if all of the decisions that we make and all of the choices that we make are actually up to our volition. They can be decided on the basis of our volition. But are they really? Are they really? Are they really freely made? That's the question that we'll be looking at today when we talk about freedom, determinism, compatibilism, and so forth. And so anyway, let's go ahead and dive right in. And here's the question: do you believe in fate? Do you believe that human beings can affect the course of their destiny through the exercise of their choice? Or do you believe that all choices, even though they are apparently freely made, are in fact the result, the inevitable result of thousands, if not millions, or even billions of events that have happened before them in order to pave the way to make sure that that decision is determined and could not have happened otherwise? And that really is the question. When we boil it all down, here's the question of human freedom. In any given decision that you have ever made, could you have possibly chosen differently? In any given decision that you have ever made, could you have possibly chosen differently? That's not the question of, if I were to go back knowing everything that I know now, would it be possible for me to take a different option? Because you wouldn't certainly be able to do that. However, that doesn't actually adequately answer the question. The question is if in any given decision, could you have chosen differently? If somehow you could hit rewind on all of history, rewind to that decision, is it possible that you could have chosen differently? Now, here's the thing. Some people might answer that question like this. They might say something along the lines of, well, yes, I could have chosen differently. I mean, I had legitimate options that were available to me. I could have, for example, if I got up this morning and I was getting ready to eat breakfast, I could have had Wheaties, or I could have had scrambled eggs or French toast. I had all of these things in my kitchen, in my cupboards. And so I could have legitimately chosen between any one of them. I could have, I could have changed my mind. So I had the choices. Therefore, the existence of those choices is enough evidence of the fact that I had the ability to choose. But that really isn't correct, is it? Because the existence of options that are open to you doesn't necessarily mean that you had the freedom to choose from among those options. The freedom either exists within you or it doesn't exist at all. The choices that you take, those things exist outside of you. So could you have chosen differently in any given decision if you could go back and do it again, given the same amount of inputs, the same amount of details and things leading up to that? And really, really, how would we know that? How would we know one way or the other if it would have been possible for us to have chosen differently given any decision that we've ever made? How could we possibly go back and re-choose without our present choice having influenced that? So how would we possibly choose? How would we know whether or not our choice would be different? Well, I want to describe two different versions of freedom that people would say that we might or might not have. And these two different versions of freedom are important for us to understand going forward in this discussion. First of all, there's circumstantial freedom. Circumstantial freedom. And circumstantial freedom is freedom from physical limitations. So a person is circumstantially free to make a choice or to take an option or a different, make the choice of between two options or more, if they are not physically restrained from doing so. If there are not limitations on their ability to do so. For example, if I were going to say, well, I want to fly to Chicago this afternoon. Well, if I'm using a plane to do so, to fly with, then I'm circumstantially free. I may be circumstantially free to do that, provided that there's a flight to Chicago and this sort of thing. However, I am not circumstantially free to start flapping my arms at a high rate of speed and fly to Chicago. Well, why not? Well, the human body does not possess the capability of flying under one's own power. We have to use some sort of mechanical device in order to fly. So circumstantially, I might be free to fly to Chicago if I'm taking a plane. However, if I'm not taking a plane, if I'm not taking any kind of motorized machine or device, any kind of mechanical device, I am not going to be able to fly to Chicago. I'm not circumstantially free. That option is not open to me. Also, another thing that would limit my circumstantial freedom is my awareness of options that are available to me. If I have a decision coming up and it seems to be a dilemma, I can only see one of two different directions to go in this particular dilemma, and yet neither one of them really seem to be options that I want to take. However, I don't know of any other options. Let's say that there is actually a third option out there, but I don't know about it. Well, then I am not circumstantially free to take that option. If I am not aware of that, if I can't imagine that it's there, if I can't think about it, if no one tells me about it, if I'm not aware of the option that's available to me, then I'm not going to take it. So I'm not circumstantially free to choose that option. So that's a bit about circumstantial freedom. Circumstantial freedom is when circumstances allow me the possibility of choosing that direction. Now, this will become more of an important thing when we talk about compatibilism, which is the third view that we'll look at in this series. Circumstantial freedom becomes a little bit more important there. But for the purpose of comparing the first two views that we'll look at, that would be determinism and what might be known as libertarianism or existentialism. When we look at the first two views, the definition of freedom that we want to entertain is this second one, and that is metaphysical freedom. Metaphysical freedom. Now, metaphysical freedom is the freedom of the self to choose among genuine alternatives. So the alternatives are there, the genuine alternatives are there. Am I free to choose? Do I have, or is there something that is forcing my decision? Now, I may not feel like my decision is being forced, but it's possible that I might not feel like it, and nevertheless it is being forced. So metaphysical freedom is the freedom of the self to choose from among genuine alternatives. There's option A and option B. Then am I able to actually exercise my will to do what I wish? So could I choose now option A? And if time were to be able to be rewound, could I go back and choose option B, given the same exact input into the choice? Is there a freedom to choose between the two? Well, the first view that we'll look at is that of determinism. Determinism. And determinism is the idea that all human choices are determined. They're predetermined. They're determined by cause and effect. They're determined by pre-existing conditions and circumstances that are in our lives that render our decisions and the inevitable. It renders them inevitable. We are going to follow that course. We are going to follow that path. The determinism is the claim that somehow, and we'll talk about how in just a minute, but somehow our choices could not be otherwise. So whatever I chose to eat for breakfast this morning, I could not have possibly chosen otherwise, perhaps because of pre-existing conditions in my life. I could not have chosen otherwise. Now, determinism goes on to say human beings are not free. There's no free will. There's no way in which we could have chosen otherwise in any given decision. Therefore, human beings ultimately are not responsible for their moral decisions. So because my decisions have been made for me by pre-existing conditions, by things that have cause and effect that have happened before my decision was actually made, because I have no freedom to have chosen otherwise, then I am not ultimately morally responsible for my actions. Now, there may be consequences for those actions, but ultimately there's no moral responsibility. There's no, I'm not violating any moral code, even if somebody might have to restrain my behavior because it's becoming harmful to people around me. So more on that in just a moment. But so determinism says no, we're absolutely determined. All of our choices, none of our choices are free. All of them are the result of pre-existing conditions and circumstances. So what are the sources of determinism? What are these pre-existing conditions and circumstances that lead into my decision not being able to be freely made? Well, there could be several. There could be several sources of determinism. For example, one of them is determinism is physical. Determinism is physical. In this view, this is held by a philosopher, or a scientist and philosopher, B.F. Skinner, a psychologist. And but determinism is basically physical, and this view says that human beings are basically a very complex biochemical machine. You look into our bodies, and every part of our body is made up of the same kind of elements that you find in the rest of the universe. Right? There's no different spark of element within human beings that is special, that is different than anything we see anywhere else. So basically all of our behavior then is the process, or the outworking of this process of biochemistry. And just like certain chemicals, when you put them in the presence of one another, they don't have a choice of whether or not to react. So also, when a certain number of inputs are put into this biochemical machine that we call our human body, then the reaction is going to be inevitable. Now, the number of and the complexity of those inputs is mind-boggling. It's too many to even begin to consider, and so it has the appearance, because of this, it has the appearance of being a freely made choice. However, if we were to know all of those inputs and we were able to correctly assess the relationship with one another, then we could absolutely, with 100% accuracy, predict what any given person is going to do at any given decision. So it's a biochemistry sort of thing. Chemicals reacting with one another, they cannot do otherwise. And the argument here, as we look in the physical sciences, the argument here seems to be a very strong one, a very persuasive one. And I say that because there's nothing in this world, there's no chemical reaction in this world that has any way of choosing to do otherwise. When you put certain chemicals in the presence of one another under certain circumstances, and they're going to react in a very predictable way, and that is in microcosm, says the determinist, what takes place within our brain, within the chemistry of our brain. So determinism on one level is physical. It takes place at the atomic level. It takes place at the molecular level. It takes place at the biochemical level, and so forth. So that's one source of determinism, but that need not only be the only one. There could be other sources of determinism as well. For example, and these are not mutually exclusive. They can work together in conjunction to form a very, very increasingly complex system of controls and determining factors. So determinism is physical. On the other hand, determinism is also social and psychological. And of course, psychologists will look at this, and they will. There are schools of psychology. Determinist schools of psychology. Behaviorism is a version of this, and so forth. The idea here is that it's sort of like the Pavlov's dog thing. You can program someone or something, a living organism, you can program them to react and respond in certain ways to certain stimuli. So determinism is social or psychological. Our social interactions and relationships are going to determine what we can do and what we cannot do. They're going to program us with certain biofeedback. They're going to program us with certain reward structures that will incentivize certain kinds of behavior and de-incentivize other behaviors. And all of these things serve to determine our behavior. Now, again, those are tremendously complex even within a single individual, right? We have influences, social influences and psychological influences. Some of it is nature, some of it is nurture. We have a certain genetic makeup that predisposes us to certain kinds of desires and behaviors. We also have our upbringing and our past, the things that we were exposed to as a child and earlier in life. All of these things really just kind of determine our behavior. They affect our behavior. They affect our outlook on life, which ultimately is going to have a determining factor on the choices that we make. So determinism is social, determinism is psychological, determinism is physical. And one other source of determinism, primarily what we've looked at so far is really on the physical level and on the social psychological level. These are things that are that could very easily take place in a materialist or humanist worldview, and so you've got religious folk on the other side saying, well, yeah, the only source of freedom is the possibility of the source of freedom is the soul or is God. However, determinism isn't necessarily, that area as well is not necessarily free from determinism. For example, some versions of determinism are theological in nature. Versions of different religious groups and religious beliefs are theological, are determining in nature. For example, within the Christian traditions, there's the tradition of Calvinism, which sees God as being sovereign over all things that happen. So sovereign, exhaustively sovereign, God controls all things. And then, so you get down and ask the question, okay, does God control my choices? And the answer for Calvinism is yes, God is the one who chooses whether or not that person will be a believer. God is the one who awakens that believer to faith versus some sort of choice that they make. The believer does not have free will in the sense that they cannot choose to choose God. They cannot choose to worship God. God has to come in and open their hearts and open their minds in order for them to be able to worship God as God desires. And so really that's another source of determinism as well. Some of it is theological. So whether the sources are physical, social, psychological, theological, determinism says all of these things come together and they form a confluence by which the choices of any individual at any given time are not freely made. Can you think of a single choice in your life that has not been made from consideration of pre-existing circumstances? And the determinist would say there's no such thing. Every choice that we make is the outcome or the outworking of these pre-existing circumstances. So determinism, physical, social, psychological, and theological. Now, on the consequence of believing in this for the determinist, the consequences for the determinist of saying that all choices are determined, where this meets with moral responsibility is such that the determinist will say that my decisions, your decisions, because they were determined by pre-existing conditions, we are not morally responsible for those. Because choices are determined by outside cause and effect, because they're predetermined by genetics or chemistry or social and psychological interactions, or maybe even God, people are not morally responsible for their decisions. That's what the determinist would say. So moral responsibility is not a thing. So freedom itself is actually an illusion that is brought on by the ignorance of the immensity and complexity of causes and effects. We're not aware of most of them. And so therefore it looks like our decision is actually freely made when actually it is not. So that's determinism in a nutshell. Our choices are not freely made, therefore we are not morally responsible for them. Now, one might ask, wait a minute, what does this do then? How are we able to create law, and how are we able to justifiably incarcerate people who have chosen to do things that are antisocial if they're not morally responsible for them? Basically, the way that we create laws, according to the determinist, is this. We make laws that work out basically for the benefit of the majority. And when someone violates those laws, even though they are not morally responsible for their decision of violating those laws, nevertheless, their behavior becomes detrimental to the people around them. And their behavior is going to affect the behavior of the people around them. And so what we need to do is kind of take them out of society and quarantine them, and then take an effort or make an effort to rehabilitate that person. Now, this, interestingly enough, it really is only possible from within the context of a determinist worldview. Because think about this for just a moment. If I did not believe that circumstances played a role in my behavior, if I did not believe that pre-existing conditions and circumstances played a role in the reason that I choose to do what I do, then why would I bother trying to rehabilitate somebody? Why would I bother trying to influence their decision if they could always freely choose to do something else, regardless of how I had tried to rehabilitate them? Rehabilitation then becomes the goal for the determinist, which actually only makes sense from within that context, because the determinist, only the person who believes, look, unless I believe that things that I do can impact the behavior of someone else, then I'm not going to bother trying. If I believe that person could freely choose to do something totally different than what they're actually doing, then there's no real reason for me to try to influence their behavior through circumstances or consequences or anything of that nature. So determinism is the framework within which a person conducts rehabilitation. Now, we're not going to try to get our pound of flesh, right? A person is not morally responsible. If I'm a determinist, the person is not morally responsible for their behavior, so I'm not going to try to punish them. But what I might try to do is rehabilitate them. So that is that's the goal of, or the end goal of determinism. Now, there are, however, some issues with determinism. People have realized some of them anyway. And let me just run down a few of them, and we can see them one at a time. Number one, for the determinists, for their view, it sort of reduces mankind to a machine. So mankind becomes a machine in the eyes of the determinists, a biochemical, sociological, psychological machine that can do nothing other than what it's programmed to do. You know, that's what you do. That's what computers do. You input the software, you input the information, and they have a certain protocol that they run, and that program sort of spits out. That program spits out the result. It can't do otherwise. It does exactly what it's programmed to. And if there's a glitch in the programming, then that affects it, right? The goal then is to go back and fix the glitch. Well, mankind is a machine under determinism. We're a machine that if we go wrong or go broken, we're a machine to be fixed, and that's about it. So that doesn't sit well with a lot of people. The idea that human beings and all that we are and all that we desire and all that we aspire to are machines. But there have been some who have embraced this idea. For example, Bertrand Russell is a philosopher of the 20th century, the 19th and 20th century, who himself was a very outspoken atheist and who championed the notion of trying to engage the world consistently through an atheist worldview. And so this is one of the things. He wrote an essay called A Free Man's Worship. And this is what a quote from: that man is the product of causes which had no prevision of the end that they were achieving, that his origin, his growth, his hopes and fears, his loves and beliefs are but the outcome of an accidental collocation of atoms, that no fire, no heroism, no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve an individual life beyond the grave, that all the labors of all the ages, all the devotion, all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system, and that the whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins, all these things, if not quite beyond dispute, are yet so nearly certain that no philosophy which rejects them can hope to stand. Only within the scaffolding of these truths, only on the firm foundation of unyielding despair, can the soul's habitation henceforth be safely built. That's what Russell is saying. That's what Russell said. He believes that human beings are a machine. Human beings are a part of the universe, and they will suffer the same fate as the universe, and that there is really no objective, overarching meaning to human choices, human freedom, and human thought and aspirations. But that's one issue with determinism, and not everybody is willing to live with the idea that man is a machine and the consequences of that as it might have on meaning. Another issue that that people will have oftentimes with determinism is the fact that there's just simply not enough evidence to substantiate it. And what we mean by this is that, yes, we look into the universe around us, and yes, it does appear as if everything is determined, and it would seem that if everything else is determined, that human decisions also would be determined. However, we don't have a direct way of establishing that, of proving that. That's just an idea that seems to be a logical outworking. However, we don't have experimental evidence of this. As certain fields of thought like neuroscience develop, they sometimes seem to have evidence of this that establishes this. However, it should be very closely examined. There are a lot of assumptions that go under some of the things that in the developments that neuroscience and psychology and behavioral psychology, things like this, have. But at present, there's really not enough evidence. If you were able to predict accurately, with 100% accuracy, what people would choose in a given situation, then perhaps that would be evidence. And another problem evident with determinism is that it seems to undermine the human experience. We don't have the sensation that we are determined. We don't have that experience. I mean, even the most ardent determinist will get up and make several decisions throughout the course of his day. And he does not, in making those decisions, innately feel as if those decisions were not his to make, that they are predetermined. Now, he might think, he might muse upon them and think about, okay, well, I had eggs for breakfast because obviously, I wanted some protein as opposed to a sugar rush this morning, and that's better. That's better for me. Or, a person might say, I chose to go into this field of study rather than this field of study because of this, that, or the other. And they'll list some antecedent contexts or circumstances that gave rise to their decisions. However, people generally have the idea that when they make a decision, they are the ones making the decision. When they make a choice, they are the ones in control of that choice. That seems to be the default setting for human beings as it relates to our freedom. So that is determinism. Now the next school of thought that we'll look at is what might be called indeterminism, or a specific branch of that known as libertarianism. Now, I should say at the very beginning here that libertarianism is as we are talking about it, as it relates to the question of human freedom, is not exactly the same thing as libertarianism as it relates to a political party. When you go out to vote and you get your ballot, what you'll notice is there are Republicans, there are Democrats, and then there are libertarians. And the libertarians are a political party that believe in things, among other things. They believe in small government, typically, which means that they believe that the individual should have a maximum amount of freedom so as to do whatever they want to do, so long as they are not harming someone else. So that's kind of a libertarian platform as it relates to politics. Now, that kind of libertarian is not the same kind of libertarian that we're going to talk about as it relates to human freedom. Very important principle here, because inevitably on exams and on questions, posting, discussion forum questions discussion forum questions, I will ask, what does a libertarian believe in relationship to human freedom? Inevitably, I'll get somebody who will answer the question, well, a libertarian believes in small government. A libertarian believes that people should be able to do whatever they want to without harming one another and this sort of thing. That's going to be a wrong answer to the question. Okay, so when we talk about a libertarian in relationship to the question of human freedom, we're talking about someone who believes that we are not determined like the determinist believes. We're talking about someone who believes in the existence of free will. In other words, if we were to ask them the question, could I have chosen differently in any given situation? They would say, yes, you could have chosen differently. Now, they may agree, and as we'll see, there are a certain body of factors that tend to lean us one way or another. Nevertheless, we still had the choice to choose one way or the other. We could have gone the other way in any given decisions. We do have free will. We have the ability to have chosen otherwise. Therefore, we are morally responsible. And that is the libertarian view over and against the determinists. They believe, yes, we do have free will as defined, that we could have chosen differently in any given decision, and therefore we are morally responsible. The first version of libertarianism that we'll look at is what is known as agency theory. Agency theory. And agency theory is a form of libertarianism that basically seeks to try to define the difference between different kinds of causation. It tries to assert the difference between different kinds of causation to assert that, yes, people do have free will. For example, they will say that there are two different kinds of causation: event causation and what they call agent causation. Now, event causation, according to the person who believes in agency theory, is when events are the necessary outcomes of causes that have taken place. So, for example, if I'm playing a game of pool or billiards, and I take the cue stick and I strike a cue ball so that it goes and strikes another ball, so that ball then goes into the pocket that I intend. Basically, what I have done with my cue ball is I have set up a series of events that lead to the outcome of that ball being going into the corner pocket, for example. Every one of those. So my cue stick striking the cue ball striking the other ball going into the corner pocket. All of those things have been caused by something that has taken place before them, and they are the necessary outcomes of the event that has taken place before them. There's no freedom in event causation. However, those who believe in agency theory believe in a second kind of causation, and that is the causation that is caused by one who is free, and that is known as agent causation. A free agent, and we're not talking basketball here, but a free agent is a person who basically can choose one way or the other to then set off a chain of events that cause one another. But that initial event that was caused by the agent was not caused by anything other than their free choice. So agent causation is when events take place that are caused by those who are free agents, a person who is capable of making a free choice. Now, this seems to be a very convenient argument because while it does try to define the distinction between different forms of causation, nevertheless, this view also does not necessarily go and explain how a person is free, how an agent is free. How does that person rise above the machine that is the rest of the universe? What is it that they are able to grasp hold of in order to make their choices free? It doesn't address that at all. In fact, this almost seems to be begging the question, right? If you're trying to prove that human choices are free by simply defining a choice as free, that is in no way establishing that it has actually been freely made. So that's agency theory. Perhaps, however, the more famous and more common version of libertarianism is what is known as existentialism. existentialism. So what we're going to look at next is what is known as existential freedom. Now, existentialism begins with the premise that you are absolutely free in anything and everything that you choose. In other words, it doesn't try to prove that a person is free and not determined. It starts out with that assumption: you are absolutely free. You are radically free, says Jean-Paul Sartre, who is one of the thinkers we'll look at. In fact, the major thinker associated with existentialism. He's not the first, but he did write some of the more important treatises on this thought. Jean-Paul Sartre was a philosopher in the 20th century, an existentialist philosopher in the 20th century who lived and did his work around the time of the Second World War. And Jean-Paul Sartre, his major idea can be summed up in 3 words: existence precedes essence. Existence precedes essence. Now, what does he mean by existence precedes essence? Well, conventional wisdom would tell us that a thing as a category or a category of things exists before an individual thing of that category exists. For example, the category of human beings, that category has existed for a long time, long time. However, I, as a human being, have only existed for a certain amount of years, just almost approaching 5 decades. So I have existed for about 5 decades. So conventional wisdom would tell us that what it means to be a human, because it pre-existed my existence, then my essence, the essence of me, I'm a human being, that's my essence precedes my existence. So my essence as a human being existed before my own personal existence, therefore essence precedes existence. Now that's normally what conventional wisdom would tell us. However, Sartre turns that on its head and he says, no, existence precedes essence. Because the essence of you and the essence of me as a human being does not actually exist until I am born. I can make choices, and then through my choices, I create who I am. Through my choices, I create my essence. Through my choices, I create what it is to be me. My essence is what it is to be me. And so my essence doesn't come into existence until I do as a human being. Now, what it means for you to be a human is what is different than what it means for me to be a human. And that may be different than what it means to for another person to be a human. Each human being pours that meaning, that essence into their own definition of humanity. There is no overarching definition of humanity by which you can name this word human being, or this phrase, and that applies to everybody. What it means to be human to you is different than me and the next person, and so on. And so it's a very subjective way of making meaning or coming up with meaning. So existence precedes essence. I had to be born. I had to make morally and meaningful decisions about who or what I want to be in order to create myself through my choices. That's where my essence comes in. I create my essence through my choices. Obviously, I have to be alive to make those choices before I can create my essence. So existence precedes essence. Now, you may be thinking along, when you hear about this, okay, well, that's all well and good, Sartre, but what about those things about myself that define me as a person that I cannot control? For example, I can't control how old I am. I was born at a certain point in history, and I cannot control that part of me. I cannot control what language I speak. What was my mother tongue? What was the first language that I lived? I cannot control who my parents were. And these things all play a very important role in defining me as a person. I don't have that much control over my upbringing and how I was raised and the socioeconomic status in which I was born. Those things, I don't have any control over them. I don't have any control over any sort of disability that I might have. That's something that impairs me. I don't have a control over my gender. That is something that is natural, that I'm born with. and I have all of these things, right? These things, these factors in my life that seem to have a determining effect on me as a human being that I have no control over. And so what do I do with those, right? Well, Sartre calls that facticity. He has a term for that. It's facticity. Facticity are those factors in our lives that seem to have a determining effect in our life and over which we have absolutely no control. I don't have any control over them. You don't have any control of them. So that's facticity. Now, here's the thing, Sartre says. You have facticity in your life. You cannot control all of these things that you were born with, where you were born, what nation of citizenship you were born with, all of these things. However, what you can control in relationship to those things is how you allow those things to limit you and how you allow those things to define you. So facticity, while you cannot technically control the fact that that happens, what you can do is control the significance that plays in your life. And what, for example, if a person is born as a woman, and because of that, in the society into which she is born, there are certain roles that she has to play and certain roles that she cannot play because she's a woman. Sartre would say, well, are you going to let those things, that facticity, those gender roles in society, are you going to let that determine what you do? And are you going to let that determine the meaning of what it means to be you? Are you going to let that create you as a person? Or are you going to choose to transcend those things and ignore the significance that everybody expects those things to play in your life, and then choose to render them insignificant and go for what you want to do, create yourself for who you want to be by yourself. So yes, there is facticity, but according to Sartre, what we need to do is transcend that facticity. He calls this transcendence. Transcend that facticity, and transcendence in Sartre's his theory is the ability to make choices that overcome facticity, that limit the significance and the role that these things play in our lives, so that we can overcome those things and create ourselves for who we want to be, ultimately. So transcendence is the ability to make choices that overcome facticity. Yes, you have factors in your life that seem to limit your choice. However, you choose whether or not to allow those things to limit your choice. Okay, so transcendence. Now, if you live a life of transcendence, if you transcend the facticity in your life that tries to lock you into your role, then you are living what Sartre calls an authentic life. You are living an authentic life. Authenticity is when we are living the reality that we have chosen for ourselves. We are overcoming facticity and we are transcending that, and we are living the authentic life. That's what we need to do. That's what everyone needs to do. Now, when we don't do that, and Sartre would immediately agree that most people don't do that. When we don't do that, then what we are doing is we are living according to bad faith. Bad faith is a term that Sartre uses for when we allow facticity to control our choices in our path in life. It's when we allow facticity to control our choices or our path in life. That's what bad faith is. And so Sartre believes that we should overcome those things. We should not allow them to hamper us in what we want to do. Yes, ultimately they may provide to be insurmountable, but we do not allow even that to stop us from doing what we want to do, what we desire to do. So that's Sartre's understanding of existential freedom. In a nutshell, there's certainly more that could be said about it. Sartre was one of the ways in which he sort of outlines this, or one of the more striking examples that he gives, is he was giving a lecture, and he records this in a book later on, but he was giving a lecture at one point, and he had experienced living under Nazi captivity where he was living. The Nazis came and they occupied the area. They set up curfews and martial law and that sort of thing. And somebody sort of quipped at him, well, I bet you weren't too free while you were living under the Nazis, you know, so under Nazi occupation. When he was at one of his speaking engagements, somebody was, you know, heckling him, so to speak. And he said, and he sort of shot back at that moment, and later he records this in a book, but he shoots back and he says, no, we were never more free than we were when we were living under Nazi occupation. And you're like, hold up a second, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And of course, Sartre is certainly the kind of guy who likes to turn things on its head. But the young man who had heckled him was sitting there in a quandary, and he says, let me explain it to you. He says, under Nazi occupation, we were commanded by the Nazis not to go out and meet, you know, at certain times of the day. We were commanded by the Nazis that we couldn't have certain books, and we couldn't talk to certain people, and we certainly couldn't help the Jewish population out in any way. But here's what that did for us. What that did is it set up, all those Nazi regulations set up a system of facticity. In other words, it set up a system of circumstances that would allow us under normal circumstances to excuse our behavior as being forced, as being determined. He says, no. Even in that situation, when you have the coercion of a gun pointed at your head, you are still free to choose differently. Under Nazi occupation, therefore, if we chose to go out after curfew, what we were doing is we were choosing not to allow the Nazi facticity to have any control over who we chose ourselves to be. We were transcending and living authentically because we chose to not allow the facticity of Nazi occupation to determine who we would be. So that's what he meant when he said we were never more free than when we lived under the Nazis. And I think it's a great example of how his philosophy works out, and sometimes can cause us to sort of challenge traditional and conventional ways of thinking. But that was Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialism. Now, what are some issues with existentialism that we can sort of point to? Well, number one, the very first one that we can look at is that when properly understood, what existentialism means is that basically, even though we're influenced by external constraints, so to speak, we can still choose to do differently than what we actually do choose. Now, that's what this would mean if it were true. But the problem is that we can do, and we currently do, engage in social sciences. But it would seem that if existentialism and if libertarianism were true, that it would completely undermine the notion of social sciences. Think about this. Social sciences, let's talk about, for example, therapy, psychological therapy. When you go to see a therapist, that therapist helps you unpack some of the issues that you might have had in your life. That therapist tries to help you get at the root of it, whatever it is that you're feeling or whatever it is that your behavior, what you're choosing to do. And basically the underlying assumption of all of that as it relates to the social sciences is that you could, by altering the input and altering the environment in your life, you could choose to positively affect your choices and your decisions. These things, in other words, what it's saying is that there are things outside of just your ability to choose that weigh in on the choices that you make. If that's not true, if I'm a free agent and I can choose to do differently even despite all of those determining factors, or if I'm an existentialist and I can choose to live authentically and transcend my facticity, then the social sciences really would be nothing more than just a good suggestion, right? There's no way in which we would be able to actually affect our behavior and get behind some of the causation for our behavior and try to positively impact that, because there's no causation to our behavior. In agency theory, there's no causation to our behavior. In existentialism, we are radically free, so there's no causation to our behavior other than what it is that we actually choose to do in that moment. So it would seem to undermine and contradict the underlying assumptions for the social sciences of psychology and sociology and some cultural studies and things like this. Another problem with libertarianism is just the objection of we can influence other people. It's possible for us to influence others. It's possible for me to use my relationships and my knowledge or my, or shared experience in reason with someone in order to influence their behavior. I mean, I'm a pastor and I do that quite a bit, actually. I engage in counseling. And as I sit across the counseling table from someone who has come to me seeking advice, certainly I know the power that I have to be an influence on their behavior. I've seen it happen quite a bit, and therefore the idea that that even though we engage in all of that a person could just simply choose to do otherwise, that seems to be not altogether 100% persuasive, because we can and do influence one another's behavior. I mean, isn't that, for example, what parents do when they discipline their children and provide positive and negative outcomes and feedback given certain behavior, positive rewards for good behavior, negative consequences for bad behavior, and so forth. That's what parents are trying to do. They're trying to form their children's behavior by influencing them. Now, specifically in relationship to existentialism, perhaps one of the most significant and yet overlooked consequences that we have as it relates to existentialism is that in existentialism, because I'm creating what it means for me to be a human, and because you're creating what it means for you to be a human, there is no real objective basis for ethical value. There's no real objective basis. Now that word's important, objective. There's no real objective basis for ethical value. You create your value, I create my value, and what's good for you is good for you, what's good for me is what's good for me. And so we should just all live according to our own subjective evaluation of our humanity. But the problem of that, it means basically that until a person is able to create themselves through their choices, then they have no value whatsoever, and they're basically disposable. There's no innate human value. You have to earn your value through your choices. You have to create your value through your choices. And while that may, on the one hand, seem to be very ennobling, on the other hand, it also just purges our humanity. Because there is no nobility to what it means to be human. Humans are nothing unless they create themselves to be something. Now, what that might mean practically is, for example, when a child is born, how long before a child starts making moral choices? Well, it might be a couple years before a child begins to understand consequences and before a child begins to understand morality or whatever the case may be, before they begin to understand or even begin to grasp the gravity of their choices that they make. And so in that intervening period where a child doesn't have the ability to make a moral decision, then is that child disposable? Because they can't create themselves through their choices. They're not doing that yet. So they don't have value. They don't have essence. Therefore, are they just disposable? Can we, because they have no meaning, do away with them if we want to? Or what about somebody who is by all outward appearances mentally handicapped or disabled to the point where they don't seem to be making any choices for themselves? Are their lives any less than yours and mine? Because it would seem that if they cannot create themselves through their choices, according to existentialism, they have no value, and they couldn't have any value. They don't have an essence, and therefore their lives are discretionary. We can do with them whatever we want to do. And furthermore, when people do begin to create themselves through their choices, right? When they get to the point where there maybe a normal adult is to the point where they can make the decisions to create myself. I want to take this path in life and become this kind of person. This is how I want to express my humanity and so forth. Okay, so if that's me and I'm in that position right now, and I'm creating myself through my choices, what is the guide that I have to say that this choice would be better than that choice, so that when I create myself through my choice, I want to create myself to be the better path? Where's the moral guideline for that? Well, with existentialism, there is no moral guideline for that. And so, for example, if I come to the corner, if I'm walking down the road and I come to the corner, And on that corner, there's this busy intersection. There's a little old lady who, is carrying some bundles, and she needs some help getting across the road. I have some choices to make as a libertarian, as an existentialist. I can choose to just go on about my day and continue and let her just fend for herself. That's one choice that I could make. Another choice that I could make would be to help her across the road, to gather her burdens to myself and say, ma'am, I'll help you. And so I help her across the road. That's another choice that I make. That's another version of humanity that I can express. Another choice that I could make, potentially speaking, is to wait until the traffic is kind of busy and then push her into the street so that she gets run over by a car. And that's another version of humanity that I could choose to create in myself. So those are at least 3 different choices that I could create. Now, what standard of moral value does existentialism have to offer to tell me which of those 3 choices are better? Now, I think all of us, just by an intuition, would say, well, we can put them in first, second, and third. Which one would be best? Which one would be worst? Which would be in the middle? But wait a second. You're using your idea of good and bad, right and wrong, that you already have in your mind. You're using the facticity of our culture's understanding of what constitutes good and bad in order to make that judgment call right now. According to existentialism, you need to transcend that facticity. You need to choose your own view, whatever it is that you want to do, and then you, by doing so, create yourself however you want to be. But it offers us no moral guidelines as to what is good and what is bad, what is good, what is evil, about what we should do. So that's another significant problem with existentialism. There's no objective basis for moral value. If I choose it right for me, that's right for me, even if I'm pushing old ladies in the road into traffic. So that's a significant problem with existentialism. There's no logical, objective basis for ethical value. That's a huge thing. And then, of course, number 4, for existentialism and for agency theory is this. Where does this freedom come from? Where does this freedom come? Where does it come from? Because both of these theories begin with the assumption that it exists. Neither of these theories actually engage the question of where this freedom comes from. Because it can't come from nature. Everything we see in nature is cause. It's the result of cause and effect, except for those things that are under question, right? Like volition. Those things are questionable, but that's, if we appeal to those to establish human freedom, we're begging the question. That's a circular argument. So we have no basis for where this freedom comes from. So that's another significant problem with existentialism, with libertarianism. Well, so these so we've seen so far, we've seen determinism, we've seen libertarianism, and now we're going to get on to the third view. The third view, as it relates to human choices and the question of whether or not human choices are free, the third view is what is known as compatibilism. Now, compatibilism tries to kind of take the best of both of the previous, of determinism and of libertarianism, and tries to combine them so that it gets rid of the liabilities for both. On the one hand, determinism says that man is a machine and cannot rise above his circumstances. On the other hand, existentialism says that man has no value and no moral guidelines, objective moral guidelines, and can't define where his freedom comes from anyway. Compatibilism tries to get rid of those weaknesses by a sort of third way here. It imagines the third way. Now, however, it would be incorrect, I think, to say that compatibilism is just the result of an ad hoc sort of amalgamation of the previous two theories, right? And trying to get rid of some of the negativity while capitalizing on the positives. Compatibilism, actually, though, tries to take a different route altogether. It does so by trying to redefine what the definition of freedom actually is. Now, you'll recall that both determinism and libertarianism agreed that the definition of human freedom should be something along the lines of human freedom is when we are able to choose otherwise in any given decision that we've made. Determinism says, no, we don't have that kind of freedom. Existentialism or libertarianism says, yes, we do have that kind of freedom, but they essentially agree on what the definition of freedom should be. Now, compatibilism, however, takes issue with that definition of freedom. And it says that's actually not helpful. That's not a good definition of freedom. Rather, freedom needs to be thought of in a different way. So that human choices, under compatibilism, human choices, while they are determined, nevertheless, people are still morally responsible for their choices. Now, how do we get there? Well, we get there by redefining human freedom. We get there by redefining human freedom. And for the compatibilist, human freedom is this. Compatibilist freedom says that choices are freely made when they arise from internal psychological states, not external constraints. Choices are freely made when they arise from internal psychological states, not external constraints. Now, let me unpack this a little bit. The compatibilist says that there are basically two sets of things that determine our behavior. All behavior is determined, but there's a basic category difference between two different types of determining factors. On the one hand, we are determined by inner states, inner psychological states. On the other hand, we are determined by external constraints, things outside of our mind, outside of our internal psychological state, that sort of hem us in. Let me give you an example of some of these different categories here, or some of the things under both of these categories. For example, for inner psychological states, these would consist of things like emotions. They would consist of moods that we have. They would consist in some ways our knowledge of the options that are available to us. So emotions and moods. We might be in a particular mood one day, which would seem to determine our behavior one way, versus if we're in a good mood one day, that we might have made the decision differently. We are determined by our own personal knowledge of options that are available to us. That's an inner state. That's something that I might have a responsibility to think of. The inner states might be things like body chemistry. Am I dehydrated? Do I have an overload of potassium in my bloodstream or sodium in my bloodstream that sort of determines my mood, which then determines my decision? Past conditioning would be an internal psychological state. Memories of what has happened when I've chosen certain ways in the past might influence my present choices as well. I might have some sort of an obsession or a compulsion that has developed over time because of a learned reaction to a certain set of circumstances. All of these things are inner psychological states. And when I make a decision that is determined by these things, by the confluence of all of these things, then I am personally morally responsible for those decisions, because those arise out of internal states and internal factors. On the other hand, there are external constraints. Now, at the beginning of this lecture, we talked about two different versions of freedom, and we talked about circumstantial freedom. Generally speaking, external constraints are those things that limit our circumstantial freedom. These are things like physical limitations. I mentioned the idea that I cannot fly to Chicago from Indianapolis just on the power of my own body. I have to use some sort of a mechanical aid in order to do that. I am physically limited from and prevented from flying there under my own body's power. Maybe I'm incarcerated, and if I'm incarcerated, I cannot go, for example, to see my child's birthday because of my incarceration. My incarceration prevents that. I'm physically, externally limited from doing that. My location might prevent me or limit me. A person coercing my behavior might limit me, might be considered an external restraint as well. If my decision is determined by external constraints rather than internal states, then I am not morally responsible for what takes place. So, if I'm not home at the time and my 16, 17-year-old daughter decides to go and drive the car and gets in a wreck, I'm not responsible for not having prevented her from doing that. because my location at that time prevented me from telling her no, she can't go out and take the car and so forth. In any case, so external, if a decision or a choice or an incident that takes place is the result of an external restraint or constraint, then I'm not morally responsible for those. But I am if I did not have an external constraint and that decision or that choice was made out of my own internal psychological states. That's what the compatibilist says constitutes human freedom. One of the questions that I often ask in association with compatibilist freedom, in really kind of judging that versus our own human experience, is this. And it's designed really to get us to think about the merits of compatibilism versus determinism and existentialism or libertarianism. Have you ever done anything that is not what you most wanted to do at that moment, given the live options of which you were aware? Have you ever done anything that is not what you most wanted to do at that moment, given the live options of which you were aware? Now, let me break this question down, and I want you to consider it for a moment, and then maybe that'll lead us somewhere here. So imagine a choice that you have made, any choice, in any given choice that you've ever made. Have you ever done anything other than what you most wanted to do in that moment, given your awareness of the options that were available to you? Now, when we talk about live options, these are options that we can actually take. These are options that I can do versus options that I would like to do, but I cannot do. For example, let's say that I live in a city and I want to go to school at a school in a different city. So I live in Indianapolis. Let's say that I wanted to go to Purdue. And as I was in the process of applying to Purdue University to do some grad school work, I come to the point where, okay, I could go there, but in order to do so, I would have to move away from my mom who needs my help right now. And so instead of, what I really want to do is go to school and get my degree, but my mom really needs the help, and so I need to really stay here in Indy to take care of her rather than going out of town to go to college. So I decide to stay. I decide to live here in town and maybe take some classes online rather than going and living on campus and taking the classes there. Now, what do I really want to do? Well, I want to live there, avail myself of the interaction between myself and other students, between myself and the instructors, and be able to partake of events going on campus. That's what I really want to do. But that option right now seems to take sort of a back seat to my overriding concern for my mother. Now, I'd rather go there and do this, but I sacrifice my dream of living on campus in order to stay here, take care of my mom, and maybe take some classes online. Now, what did I really want to do in that situation? Well, you might say, well, you really wanted to go to Purdue and live on campus, and yes, I did. That was among the decisions I wanted to make, or those among the options that I wanted. But really, what I really wanted to do was to fulfill my obligation as a son to my mother. Now, I might experience a little bit of distress about that. I might experience a little bit of regret. But ultimately, what I really wanted to do is what I did, because I really was free to do anything I wanted to do. I could have chosen otherwise. I could have chosen the other option, but I didn't. And because why? Well, because everything inside of me, after having considered all things, landed on the thing that I most wanted to do in that moment was to fulfill my duty toward my obligations, my family obligations toward my mother. I did not want to leave her out to hang. I didn't want to put her in a nursing home. I wanted to fulfill that, and I wanted to take, to take this option. That's what I most wanted to do, and the evidence of that is it's what I did. Nobody was constraining me to do something other than that. So yes, that's what caused me to do what I want to do. Now, consider this question again. Have you ever done anything that is not what you most wanted to do at that moment, given the live options of which you were aware? And I would submit to you that none of us have ever done other than what we most wanted to do in that moment, given our awareness of all the options around us. Even if I am at an ATM and I'm withdrawing money from an ATM and somebody comes up and holds a gun to my head and says, "Stop, give me all your money." Okay, I've got decision. What am I going to do? Well, I could choose to give the person the money and hope that they don't kill me. I could choose to resist and say, "You're not getting any of my money," and just turn around and walk away. Of course, if that person is serious, I might get shot. If they're not, then I'll just walk away and no harm, no foul, right? Well, there's a foul, but no harm. Or I could choose to resist by trying to grab the weapon. Maybe I've had martial arts training or something, and I think I can overcome this person. So I grab the muzzle of the gun and point it away from me at the same time, trying to attack them. I'm do the movie star kind of thing. Maybe that's the choice that I make. Maybe I pull my own firearm if I happen to be carrying a firearm and fight back. There are all kinds of choices that I could make if I have those choices. Whichever choice I do end up making, however, is the choice that I most wanted to go with. It's what I most wanted to do in that moment. Even though it seems to be sort of coerced, I still have an opportunity to do whatever I want to do. And whatever choice I do make is the choice that I most desired to make. So what does all this have to do with compatibilism? Well, I would submit to you that our desires are what determine our actions. Our desires in the given moment are what determine our actions. The overriding desire in that moment, given our awareness of the options, the live options available to us, our overriding desire in that moment is what determines our actions. That's what determines us. And yes, are we morally responsible for our desires? Yeah, I think so. If those desires eventuate into actions, yes. It's one thing to want a piece of chocolate cake. It's another thing to get it. And so that desire motivates our actions. And so we are responsible for that. That's what compatibilism would say. And I've been teaching philosophy since 2012, so a number of years now. And as many times as I've answered or asked this question, I've never had anybody give me an example of a situation where they chose to do something other than what they most wanted to do in that moment, given the awareness of the options available to them. So anyway, that would be a direct outworking of compatibilism, and so it's an interesting thought exercise to do and to consider. Well, determinism, libertarianism, and compatibilism. This has been really a survey of the various views as it relates to whether or not human choices are freely made. Go ahead and make sure that you check the syllabus, do all the quizzes, the homework, the discussion forums if there are any, and go ahead and get those finished, and we will see you in the next video. Have a great week.